Okay, so I know on my instructional part that we're going to do, it says ink wash. Now, who here has ink wash supplies? Jay, you got ink wash? Awesome. Okay, I am impressed. Who has watercolor supplies? Jay has those too. Kat, good job. All right. So ink wash and watercolor are very similar. However, ink wash is less forgiving, especially if you spill it wherever you're working, especially like on the carpet. There's a place at my folks' house with a big black spot on the carpet where I was working on an ink wash project. The bottle of Indian ink spilt over, and trust me, it's like acrylic paint. You can't get it out unless you use scissors. Okay, so most people use Indian ink, which is, it's a great ink to get, comes in a little bottle. One of my mentors uses Chinese laundry ink. It's comes in a bigger bottle, and it's, for the money, it's usually a bit cheaper, and you got a lot more. The gentleman, this was given to me by, his name's Maurice Noble. He worked on Snow White, worked with Walt Disney, worked on the original backgrounds for Snow White, worked with Chuck on his backgrounds for a lot of his cartoon, co-produced, co-directed with Chuck as well. Good guy, good guy. So India ink or Chinese laundry ink? I use Chinese laundry ink. And if we're going to do watercolors, they're both very similar in the way they react to how you apply them. Watercolor, you have wet on dry, you have dry on dry, you have dry on wet, you have flat wash, you have a gradient wash, and you have a variegated wash. Those are just different techniques for applying watercolor. So ink wash I like because it gives you, you concentrate solely on value. You concentrate solely on value when you're doing ink wash. So I have made these 3 containers. And for ink wash, it goes a long way. It takes only a little bit of ink to make your values. So I generally, 1 is my lightest value, 2 is my middle value, 3 is my darkest value. Now, do any of you have watercolor paper? Jay, good job. Okay, so watercolor paper, there's 2 ways you can approach watercolor paper. You can buy it in a pad. I had a big pad that I cut in half to make smaller sheets. So that way they're easier to manage. Now you can work on the pad dry, or you can work on it wet. Now, if you work on it wet, it generally takes a day to prepare, maybe a day and a half or 2. You soak the whole thing in water and you let it soak it with water so it's wet. Excuse me, I'll be right back. I need to get a board. So if you soak the whole paper and it's wet, you get like a staple gun, and you would, as it's wet, you would staple this to the paper, to the board, and you would let this dry. And when it dries, the paper will try to contract. And when the paper contracts, the staples will prevent it from stretching back. So when you paint on it, the paper won't ripple. Since it's already stretched out because it was wet, when it dries, it'll keep your surface flat. That's a technique if you're working on a project that you want it to, like a bigger project. You can see here I was working on a small birthday as a birthday card. I've worked on projects about yay big. It depends on what size you want, but this is a great technique if you really want to do watercolor. The paper I used was this big. I threw it in the bathtub, got it soaked, stapled it to the corners of the board. It couldn't contract because it was stapled, but when it dried, it stayed stretched. And when you paint it, it doesn't ripple. Because if you notice, if you've ever painted with watercolor, your paper ripples because it has a lot of water. So a lot of times you try to put a light layer of water on your paper so it's not completely soaked. Okay, so you can do watercolor, you can do ink wash if you want to follow with me. So the basics of any great painting or piece of art or illustration, it all starts with a solid foundation for drawing. Without a solid drawing or an image that you like, the painting is just a technique that'll go over it. It won't replace good drawing. So always remember, draw, draw, draw. Because a painting is basically going to start out the same concept as a drawing. So when you do use watercolor, think about what you're using. You can use a Prismacolor pencil, much like the Prisma stick I showed you before. You could use it as a pencil version. And let's draw a rose. Now you could do it in color or you could do it in ink wash. So we're going to start our rose out. We're going to start with a light circle down here. Now let me know if I'm going too fast or if you need me to slow down. Now keep your lines light. You don't want them too dark because these are just going to be the preliminary sketches for the painting. Now you also want to use a medium that's not going to bleed with the water. So either it's non-water soluble, or you could use water soluble. If you want to use watercolor pencils, you can, but just keep in mind that that's going to mix with your painting. You can either use a graphite pencil or a Prismacolor pencil. This is like a crayon, so it's waxy. It's going to repel the water. It's not going to absorb it. It's going to be a simple rose, nothing fancy. And if your rose doesn't look exactly like mine, that's fine. It's your rose. It doesn't have to. It's yours. You make it whatever you want it to make it to be. Okay, so now there's several ways we can approach this. Now, if you see behind me, what I have a couple of containers with water. I have a spray bottle. Now the spray bottle, I'm going to lightly spray just to dampen the paper so that the ink wash can move easier and it's not going to be stuck to where I want it to go. I generally will start with the lighter value because then you could build up. Now you want to keep your highlights white, so the white of the paper becomes the white of your painting. So you got to kind of prepare and plan for how you want to set it up. So in my mind, part of this is going to be in light and part of it's going to be in shadow. So you got to keep in mind as you're doing this, which parts you want to be the lightest and the darkest. So like I'm keeping these areas light. I'm not painting it because that's going to be my highlight. Now, another way you could do it is you could just paint it over it and then you can get like a white gouache if you want to use a different approach and then just paint the white back in. Okay, so I got my light value in. Now I'm going to work on my next value. Like I said, I'm only working with 3 tones here. And be careful if you're doing ink wash, kind of have it on a steady surface. Don't rush. You don't want to knock it over. So now I'm going to go with my middle tone. Now you got to remember with ink wash, it's easy to go dark. It's not as easy to go lighter. So that's why I start with light and go to dark, because then you can selectively choose what areas you want to push back further and what areas you want to be your middle value. So this is my middle value that I'm putting in right now. And with ink wash also, you can layer it. So if I let this dry, I can come back in, put another layer on. I can come back in and put another layer on, and that will also make it darker. But that's the thing is you have to wait for it to dry. Now, if you worked with acrylic paint, if you're ever familiar with acrylic paint dries pretty fast. So you don't have to wait for acrylic paint to dry as much as you have to do for watercolor. So now that I'm putting my middle value in, I'm also sculpting with the paint. It's called chiaroscuro. Leonardo da Vinci, I think, created the term. It's where you're molding your figure, your painting with paint. So you remember in our basic forms, basics of drawing, we talked about core shadow. You can see I'm starting to push it right here. I'm starting to push a core shadow right there along, not the edge, but part of the middle of my painting. That core shadow is going to help your piece that you're painting turn in space. If you have any questions as I'm doing this demo, please feel free to chime in. And also, here's another good thing to have around when you are doing watercolor or ink wash, a rag. Because now suppose there's too much, I don't like this mark here. You take a watercolor rag, you can dab your painting and pick that up. Pick that up before it dries. So if I don't like how it's too dark right there, I can dab it. Now I just pick some of that up. Okay, now I'm going to throw in my third value. Now, remember this third value, take a look here. This third value is my darkest value. So I'm going to use it sparingly because I don't want this to overwhelm the drawing. You want it to be used in places where it needs it. So for example, one of the darkest parts on here is going to be this bottom edge. Part of it's going to be this. I'm going to punch that core shadow. I'm going to hit this core shadow again. And I think I hit it a little too much. So then you get your brush, bring it back in and thin that out. And then grab your rag and you can pick that back up. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to come back here and clean up the drawing just a little bit. Maybe a little hard because the paper is still a little damp. So my paper is getting a little dry. So I'm going to shoot a little water on it, dampen it up a little. And for composition purposes, I'm going to use my darkest value in this upper edge, because those are where most of my highlights are. And that value of the contrast of that dark and light is going to really punch that edge of the painting. Composition is an abstract idea. Composition is basically just moving the viewer's eye around the page. You're controlling where you want that person to look. Now I'm using my second value, my second tone for ink wash, so that I'm gradiating over, blending the two. And you can even bring it down here if you wanted to. My paper is getting a little damp. It's starting to ripple a little. So you just give it a time, or you could start, as this one's drying, you could start another piece. And if something's too dark, you add a little water to it. Help dilute it just a bit so it's the right value or right tone that you want. So you guys are working on your projects. I'll show you what I have set up behind here. This is good for ink wash, but mostly this setup's good for watercolor. Usually I'll take a gallon container, but for the class, I got a half-gallon container of an empty container of water, and this one had creamer in it, but they both had water in it. And what I use them for is, you'll see more when I get to watercolor. One I use for cleaning my brush. Because if you don't clean your brush every so often, your colors or your ink washes will get muddled. So I'm going to let this sit and dry for a little bit. How you guys doing on yours? You guys doing okay? Well, keep working. If you guys have something you want to share, feel free to. Okay, as I let this dry, I'm going to start another piece. You guys keep working or you can join me. I'm just going to pick a character that I've drawn before. It's a character I created a while ago. Let me introduce you to Pencilton. Okay, so I got my sketch. And so I want to start coloring him. Now there's a technique. There's wet on dry, dry on dry, wet on wet. I'll use a little bit of both. There's another technique that I like to use. It's called island wet wash. It's called island wet wash because everything is kept separate. Okay, so I got my paint palette. Watercolor, if you want to paint while you're traveling or you're outside at the park, watercolors are one of the best, easiest things to use. And so is ink wash. Ink wash is good to use also. But so I'm going to get some water on this brush. Now this is called island wet wash because everything is painted separately. Like everything's an island, so it's all apart. It's not wet on wet where it all mixes together. I'm not putting a lot of water. It's just enough to give the impression of color. Because the more color, the more water you use, the more time you're going to have to let that dry. But watercolor is great for getting color down fast, easy. You don't have to plan a whole lot. You don't have to set it up a whole lot. So I got gray. Now what I'm going to use for my gray is, since I already have my ink washes out, I'm going to use my lightest ink wash. And that's going to be part of his tubing for his neck. Now you see how there's a lot of water buildup? It's starting to drip. This is where your rag can come in handy. And you see I just picked it right up. So there's a little too much water on that. I'll go back in, hit it with not so much water. Don't forget the graphite, the tip of the pencil. So now coming to the eraser, his eraser is pink, and it seems like we only have red. We only have red on our color palette. So what you do is you're just going to want to dilute that red a lot. Another way to get pink is red and white, but we don't have white. So we're going to take this red and we're just going to really dilute it so it's a thin, transparent red. And don't feel that you have to be so precise and careful with your watercolor, because it's forgiving. It's like oil paints are forgiving too, but it's forgiving. So you can come back in and say, oh, look, I painted part of his eye and that's supposed to be white. Well, you can come in and pick that up with your rag and that'll pick up most of that color. You can also go in later after it's dry, and if you wet it, that you could still pick it up too. There's certain things you can do, like if suppose I didn't like any of the color in the painting. If I took this and stuck this in a tub of water and let it sit and rinse it around, maybe you can even add a little bleach, it would take off a lot of the color and you could redo it again. So watercolor is forgiving because it allows you to do a lot. So within that short time, I already got the gist of most of his colors. Yellow, pink, a little gray, silver. Watercolors, it's fun. It's just like painting by numbers. But there's no numbers. You decide where you want it to go. So if you see how that's still kind of running on that 2 right here at the bottom, it's because the paper's still pretty saturated with water from the previous paint. So, waiting, taking your time, letting it dry. That's why it's good. You could start on multiple paintings at the same time. So you could start one, come back to it later. So this is called Island Wet Wash because I'm trying to keep it all separate. I'm not trying to, some people you have wet on wet where you can mix your colors if you want to mix them. Suppose you're painting a sky and there's blues and oranges and reds in the sky and they all blend in together. Then you may want to use the wet on wet technique where it gradiates and blends in to different ones. Okay, now I may start wanting to mix some of my colors. Suppose I want to start creating more shadowing on his body or his head. So I may want to take this darker red and just give it a small hit. To create a little value. To create some core shadows. Maybe add a little yellowish ochre to his body. Give it a little more dimension. Okay, so now this is turning to wet on wet. You see how his body isn't completely dry? And as I lay that other paint down, it bleeds into it. So we use that for us. We use that to work with us. You can't really go wrong. It's you know, it's a great fun way to learn. You can make your own postcards. You get a big piece of watercolor paper. You could cut this in half. This piece right here, you can make 2 postcards, fold it in half, make a birthday card for somebody. I don't like what I did here. It's too dark for this arm. So I'm just coming in with my rag. I blot it, and look, I picked it right up. Now, suppose I want to get rid of more of that. Wet my brush, clean my brush, just get it wet. Go over it with a wet brush, clean. And look, that's completely almost gone. So watercolors are forgiving. Oils are forgiving as well, but oils are a bit messy, and oils take a long, long time to dry. They're fun. It takes a while to learn them, but it's something to, if you want to dab in oils, I suggest they have ones that are water soluble that you can clean up with soap and water. They have other ones that are not, so it's a little more of a cleaning process to clean your brushes, to clean your palette. He's still kind of wet, and I want to punch his eyes, and I want to punch up the inside of his mouth and the 2 in the pencil. But we'll see if this is going to take, because being that it's still wet, it may not react the way I want it to. His eyes are okay because they're pretty much dry. like I said, you can make your postcards, you can make birthday cards, and you made it yourself. And it's watercolor. Look how much watercolor you have, and look at how much you use just to make your piece. Acrylic paints, a little more pricey. Oil paints, a little more pricey, a little more messy, harder to control. It's a great, easy medium because you could go outside, like I said, go to the park, you can paint the trees and be done. You don't have to carry all your supplies. You just got to carry a little watercolor palette. How are you guys' pieces coming along? Nice. Anything you want to, are you at a point you can share something, Jay? Awesome. Anybody else want to share what they've got? Whether it's something we're going through within class or something on your own. There's Jay. Hey.
Hello. So I kind of used a different method. I just used a non-water soluble pen and put water on it.
So what kind of pen did you use?
I just used this pen because it's non-water soluble.
And you just used it for water. Good call.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, may I interest you in, since you're into all this and you're really keeping up, this, have you seen this before?
I think that's a watercolor pen. I'm not sure.
It's a water pen, and you just put water inside of it. So if you bring along that pen you just did that with and you went out to go sketching, you wouldn't have to bring a paintbrush and a bottle of water. All you have to do is just bring this guy right here, and you're ready to go. That's a great technique. What you just did is an awesome technique. When I do it, it'll work in a regular sketchbook. Because what I'll generally do, like this marker right here, this is one of those, those overhead markers that they use when they're teaching class and they're writing on the projector or a whiteboard. This is what this is. So if I'm out sketching and I see a person standing, you get a pen like the one you have, and you get this guy, and you throw this in, and you can add instantly a little bit of value. Just like that. So your drawing has just went up 2 steps by having a water-based pen. And I have this other, it's an artist pen, same concept. Oh, we're out of ink. But you got the idea down. The idea is you get a non-waterproof pen. And you get one of these water brush pens. Now with just those little quick marks, he's got gray pants on and he's got hair. And I didn't draw the hair because the water pen did that for me. The water brush pen did that for me. But you're on a good, you got the right idea. You got the right idea. It's to make a wash. And that's what you just did. You created your own wash. Good job. Good job. Liliana and Heather, looks like you two have been working hard, which is awesome. Thank you for playing. Can we see what you guys got? Hi.
We don't have much.
Oh, I'm sure it's plenty. Ice cube tray, another great watercolor option.
Yeah,
Nice.
that's basically all we've got right now, except Heather is also painting over there.
No, that's great. Wow, look at that watercolor set. You guys are all set. I liked also too, yeah, ice cube tray, folks. Ice cube trays is another great option to mix your colors. It's versatile. You can put a lot of colors down and you can mix colors. Good job. Anybody else got something to share? We got about 10 minutes left in class. If you have any questions about watercolor paper does make a difference. You got something to share, Tater?
Yeah, it's just an ink sketch, but it's of one of my characters, Wolf.
Well, okay. So do you know what kind of ink that is? Is it waterproof?
No, it's just I have some pens.
Well, if you feel like it,
micros,
no, that's great. I'm glad you shared. But you could try doing what Jay did if you wanted to. Get a little water, get a brush, and then start making tones on it and see if your pen will bleed enough to make a shade if you want to. But it's just another technique to work with washes. Watercolor are just washes with value, with hue, excuse me. Watercolor is value and hue versus ink wash is just value. There's no color to it, which can be more challenging. That's why I only use 3, a light, a medium, and a dark, because they can get really confusing. And if you get too many close together, it starts getting muddied. A thing about watercolors, complementary colors. If you start mixing your colors and you don't start washing your brushes too good, your colors will get muddy. They'll turn like a brownish gray if you try mixing complementary colors. Hey, Kat, how's it going? Thank you for joining us. You got something you want to share before we finish off today?
I guess I can share. It's not really ink or watercolor, just a sketch. I have watercolor stuff. I just felt like sketching.
Okay.
Let's see. Sketchbook. Where's the sketch I want to share? I guess I'll share this. I was gonna share something else, but I can't find it somewhere in my sketchbook, and I don't feel like looking. So, just a bunch of different hairstyles.
Different braids and stuff. Nice.
bunch
Well,
of different breeds and then a front view of a ponytail because my sister wanted to know how.
Nice. Well, you know what you could do? Once again, I'm going to go back to Jay. What Jay did with hers, where she took a water brush and she took a water and a brush and she just made washes. So then she created some value and tone. And that's something you may want to play with because those look great. Good job, Kat.
Yeah.
Nice. Good job. Thanks for sharing. Well, all of you working on watercolor and whatnot, Liliana, Heather, if you guys do finish those, when you do finish them, if you feel so, I would love to have you show us your finished pieces on our next class. I'd love to see them. They look like they're coming along very well. It looks good. Especially you got all those great watercolors. That's a nice set you have. So watercolor, it's one of those things that I will go out and in my sketchbook. I have different sketchbooks. This one I made. So I will go and get different papers and I'll create my own sketchbook. So this right here has has white, and this is like a smooth Bristol. It has a tone paper. Tone paper is good for watercolor or any color. Tone paper is good because you're not starting with a bright white piece of paper, you know, because that's a lot to work with. When you start with a tone, you're already working with a value, and that value can be your middle ground. So from the tone paper, you can go higher or you could go darker. You can go lighter or you can go darker. Another good example, if I wish I was teaching you all in person because there's so much to be taught, is anybody ever try drawing on black paper with a white pencil? Now that you need a lot of control with, and it's a lot of fun, and you can get some really dramatic effects from it. It's really good for portraits. Okay, so we got about 4 minutes left. Anybody else have any questions before we sign off? But keep up the good work, you guys. Watercolors is great. I'll go outside. I've gone to Disneyland, and I brought this and I threw this in my backpack with my watercolor brush and a bottle of water that I drink, and all I needed to do was just splash a little bit of that water on here, and you can paint anywhere you want. Watercolor is the traveling artist's friend. There's a thing called plein air painting, which is where you go outside and you paint landscapes, or just go in your backyard and paint what you see. It's good stuff. I'm glad you guys are doing it because you guys did really well. I wish we could do more watercolor because there's so many different techniques. One technique is, like, I talked briefly about it. I just wish I had more time to show you more of these techniques. So we got our dry brush technique. I'll go through some of them real quick. Find my brush. So the dry brush technique is basically very little water, and you're painting. And you're going to see stippling. You're going to see the brush strokes. And it's very coarse. It's good if you want to do like wood grain, if you're trying to create wood grain. Island technique was what I started showing you with the second painting. Wet wash, wet on wet is basically where you got wet paint and you're painting wet paint. So you got wet paint and you just come back in Got a different color. Come back in. Got a different color. That's basically wet on wet, but it also gives you a gradient. So if you're doing like a sunset, something like this would be good for a sunset. There's a little glare on there. It's hard to see. And so for gradients too, a good way to do a gradient is to wet your whole paper. Depending on what direction you want your gradient to go to, you start at the top. And then you pull that down. You just keep bringing it down with water. Don't add more paint in the middle, but you're bringing this all the way down. And if you hold it up, it'll let that run, and that'll create that gradient for you. That's another technique. There's about 6 or 7 basic techniques. Those were a few of them. Keep it up, you guys. You guys are doing good. Well, it's 3:30. I want to thank you guys. Remember, your donations to keep these classes running help. Without them, we couldn't offer these awesome classes to you guys. We appreciate any donation you can make if you can. And keep up making art. You guys have any questions before we leave? No? All right. We'll keep donating. Help support the arts education, folks. Thank you, Scott. Have a good day, everybody.
Darrell. Bye, everyone.